Thank you, Dr. Hobbs. That's very kind. Let's see if I can. Okay, can everybody hear me all right? Great. Okay, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today and talk about yoga therapy. I am a certified yoga therapist as well as being a psychiatrist. And this past June, I had the good fortune to go attend the International Yoga Therapy Conference right outside of Washington, D.C. And I wanted to share with you some of what I learned and talk about how yoga therapy can be useful for helping people integrate the different parts of their healthcare, whether it's therapy, behavioral interventions, and so forth. So without further ado, I do not have any financial disclosures to make. So today I've got a lot to talk about. I may not be able to cover all of it, but first of all, I would like to just try to make a distinction between yoga therapy and what is just a regular yoga class that you might attend at a gym or another facility. I want to talk a little bit about the historical development of yoga therapy. It's impossible to discuss yoga therapy without going into some detail about the philosophy of yoga because it's so divergent from our way of thinking in Western medicine. I will do my best to explain the current explanations for some of the physiological mechanisms of yoga's effects, and I'm going to do a rapid fire research review, so I have a lot more information if you would like. As we go along, I'm going to be using some different metaphors to talk about yoga therapy and compare it with maybe some other modalities we may be more accustomed to. So yoga is a system rooted in a very long tradition, thousands of years old, and its basic assumption is that our essential, unchanging nature it tends to be obscured by the ups and downs of our daily lives in these human bodies we are now inhabiting. So yoga is here to remind us of that nature that we tend to forget over and over again, moment by moment. It's rooted in classical Vedic texts as well as a rich oral tradition, and it explores our relationship to the changing phenomena of the physical world, which gives us trouble. It can be thought of as an old technology, so there's if you're doing psychotherapy or behavioral interventions, there's still work to do. You still have to dig a hole, but it helps to have a shovel, makes the work a lot easier. So I like to think of yoga as a technology that is uniquely suited to reducing suffering. You can think of it as a training method. The mind tends to roam from one thought to another, and yoga helps us rein that in and focus our attention so that we can act from a place of dispassionate calm rather than impulsive thought. It reminds us once again to dissociate from our painful union with suffering, which is what happens when we get caught up in the vicissitudes of daily life. It brings unity of the breath, mind, and senses, and allows us to abandon distractions. This quote, I'm going to give some quotes here from Gary Kraftso, who's a PhD psychologist, who is also a yoga therapist, and also from Timothy McCall, who's an internal medicine physician, also a yoga therapist. They've been working in this field a long time. So another way to think of yoga therapy is a process of empowerment. It gives patients a sense of agency to create changes in their own lives rather than having technologies or methods applied to them in a passive way. The practices of yoga therapy have evolved considerably over the centuries. Currently, asana, which is the postures, the poses, pranayama, the breath exercises, meditation, chanting mantras, using mudras, which are finger motions, adopting meaningful rituals to daily life, and a disciplined lifestyle are the main practices. And these are individualized to some extent to the student's interest and level of engagement. I wish I knew more about Ayurveda, which is the traditional medicine of India, but yoga therapy is informed both by Western medicine and Ayurvedic science. Another metaphor here. So if a person goes to a yoga class, that can be thought of as a launch pad. Okay, so that's sort of a fast track if the student is ready to another level of experience or dimension of experience. Yoga therapy is more like a life raft, that it's an intervention sometimes when nothing else has worked, and you can think of it as the application of techniques at the point of pathology, at the point where the system has broken down and nothing else is helping. It's process-oriented, so unlike Western medicine, it tends not to have quick effects, but it does have durable effects that can last months and years. And we talked about imparting a sense of agency and some control over what happens in life. The idea is the more we learn to use our minds skillfully, the more we can anticipate and avoid suffering, the suffering that is yet to come. Samskaras can be thought of as deeply ingrained, instinctual, or patterns that are negative that have been learned very early on in development. So the practice of yoga over a long period of time can help us change those samskaras and adapt to more healthy patterns. So personal ritual is important. We have some very common rituals. We watch the news, we keep track of the stock market, we watch sports games, social media, but unfortunately those rituals don't often bring us a sense of meaning and purpose and value in our lives. So rituals are constructed and adapted to help people connect with themselves. So for one person, it may be taking 5 minutes in the morning to go out and watch the birds. For another person, it may be washing the dishes mindfully for 10 minutes. So these rituals are adapted to help, again, remind each individual student of yoga therapy to return to their essential nature. It's a perspective shift. So it holds this in common with cognitive behavioral therapy, changing schemas, changing basic core beliefs. This is one of the ways that yoga therapy can augment psychotherapy. So the aim is to create stability. That may be physical, structural stability in the body. It may be a sense of psychological stability or emotional stability. Most of the conditions that respond well to yoga therapy are the ailments of affluent societies, lifestyle diseases like diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, hypertension, addictive disease. It's also very helpful with musculoskeletal problems that are otherwise hard to treat with medication. It can also help with what I like to call existential pain. The things that we all experience from time to time: insecurity, problems with relationships, blind spots, inflated sense of self-importance, self-pity, depression, and anxiety. So the outcomes that are documented in the research are sometimes a little bit more abstract or amorphous than what we may be accustomed to thinking about. So it may not be heart rate variability or hemoglobin A1C, but the person's subjective sense of fulfillment, forgiveness of self or others, decreased suffering. So things that are a little bit difficult to measure, and I'm going to talk about this some more as we talk about the research portion. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the origins of yoga. I am summarizing a lot. So Patanjali was a sage who is thought to have lived between the 2nd and 4th century, and he codified yoga in a written treatise. People were practicing yoga all over in different forms, but there wasn't a an agreed upon index of practices. So he wrote the Yoga Sutras. He is also thought to have composed important treatises on grammar and medicine. He was part of the Samkhya school of Vedic philosophy, which I don't really have time to go into, but there were many different schools. You'll hear yoga therapists talk about lineage quite a bit. So you can think of this as almost like an academic pedigree or an accreditation. This is how much the presence of a living lineage is emphasized in yoga therapy, and this provides assurance that the teachings are genuine and are coming from a place of direct experience rather than whim or some sort of cavalier invention. So this can be traced back, like I said, thousands of years. The modern era of yoga therapy is considered to have started in 1893 with Swami Vivekananda. I would love to give an entire lecture on the 1893 Columbian Exposition, but I can't do that. So there are many lineages, many traditions. Swami Vivekananda introduced yoga to the West, and the lineage that we are heir to, for the most part, in Britain and the United States, is that of Krishnamacharya and his students Desikachar, Iyengar, and Patabi Joyce. So lineage is emphasized in order to distinguish yoga therapy, a therapeutic intervention, from something that is more of a consumer experience, something that is more of a product. And I'm not saying that aerial yoga is not fun or Bikram yoga is not hot. I'm just saying that the intention is different. So we talk a lot about hedonic tone in Western medicine, the idea that we do certain things or reinforce certain habits in order to feel happy and satisfied. And so that's sort of different from the idea of a eudaimonic tone, which is emphasized in the yogic tradition. It's more of a spiritual sense of well-being and satisfaction and interconnectedness, a sense of value and purpose that is different from the sorts of satisfaction we get from a good pizza or even a good relationship. It's thought to exist on a different level. So that's why they emphasize lineage so much. Okay, the first mention in text of yoga therapy is in 14th century, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, in which patients were advised to take treatment from a physician and to take yogic treatments. I am skipping over hundreds of years here. I will return to the early 20th century when I go into the physiology. But yoga therapy, the practice of yoga, went into decline during the British occupation, then started to reemerge around 1920. In 1918, the first Yoga Institute was founded in Mumbai by Sri Yogendra. Okay, I want to come back to this for just a moment. The resurgence of yoga didn't come about in a vacuum. There was a culture of there was a physical culture that was very closely associated with nationalism. The cult of muscular Christianity, which came about in the Victorian era in Britain, was associated with physical fitness, self-discipline, masculine values, and so there was a lot of concern about producing strong men who could defend the nation. So this was happening in different forms all over the world. In the United States, we sort of inherited that concept of muscular Christianity through institutions like the YMCA, the cult of bodybuilding, the emphasis on healthy foods, temperance, Kellogg's movement. These are all happening at the same time, and the emphasis on the physical body, the purpose of the physical body is changing around that time, and those Western values get translated into India, but it has its own expression, which is kind of interesting. Okay, the 1893 Columbian Exposition, this was a celebration of the, at that time, what was regarded as the discovery of the West by Christopher Columbus. And it was intended to be a showcase of all the great achievements of Western civilization. The first Ferris wheel, the first dishwasher, many miraculous occurrences, the first incandescent light bulb. So part of this was a parliament of religions that was held at the Art Institute in Chicago. So representatives from what were thought to be the 10 great religious traditions of the world were invited to come and speak and share their perspectives. This is the first time that any big audience in America had heard anything about yoga. And Swami Vivekananda was quite an articulate and charismatic speaker and had quite an effect. Meanwhile, back over in India, the Maharaja of Mysore had a lot of health problems. This is around the early, 1920-ish. And he was not getting any help from local physicians or European physicians. And so Krishnamacharya was able to help him with some of his health problems. And he was so grateful that he gave a wing of his palace for Krishnamacharya to teach in. And so there you see him teaching a group of young boys yoga. His most famous students are Desikachar, B.K.S. Iyengar, and Patabi Joyce. And they are responsible for introducing the practice of yoga to the West in the form that we currently understand it. Okay. I'm skipping ahead. Like I said, I'll go back to the research from the 20s to the 50s in India. But these are some of the more recent developments in the institutionalization of yoga therapy in India, centers for research and practice. So around the same time, this is the late 80s, early 90s, the first use of yoga as a healthcare intervention is in Dean Ornish's program for reversing heart disease, but they didn't use the Y word. They called it stress management training. It was really a yoga class. One of the reasons I wanted to give this presentation is because of the huge surge in interest in yoga. So this 2012 report shows that the use of yoga among adults in the United States almost doubled in the last the 10 years previous. In some populations, it tripled. And this is noteworthy because healthcare trends tend to remain stable, and this much of a jump represents some sort of change in thought and change in practice among healthcare consumers. The increased prevalence of using yoga is thought to be due to its role in pain management. So there's a coincidence there between the increase in the use of yoga and the decrease in use of opioids. That's kind of interesting if you want to think about that. Integrative medicine practices are expanding in both the United States and India, all over the world, with the increased incidence of chronic lifestyle diseases, which are caused by physical inactivity, poor diet, unhealthy use of alcohol and smoking for the most part. So these are the chronic diseases that most people die from in the United States. I mentioned the conference I was able to attend, the International Association of Yoga Therapists. This was founded in 1989, in part to help delineate some professional standards for yoga therapy, so that we could distinguish it from just the more popular practice of yoga as a recreational or fitness activity. I'm going to show you several links to websites if you want to get more information on these organizations. One of the points that was emphasized at the conference I attended was you can't give what you don't have. So in yoga therapy, it's considered crucial for the practitioner to actually practice what they're teaching or recommending. The ethic of self-care is absolutely central to yoga therapy in a way that I think Western medicine doesn't appreciate in our training, or at least that wasn't my experience. Okay, so these are their logos. They have a journal, they have an association. If you're a certified yoga therapist, you could use their logo, and they have accredited training programs. Most of these operate outside the university system, but some of them have been integrated into universities. There are many types of yoga therapy. You can read all day about that if you would like. So yoga therapy has been introduced at Emory University in their physical therapy program, University of Maryland, Duke University. It's becoming more and more common for these practices to be taught in the university system. And likewise for these practices to be offered by large allopathic clinics. Just last summer, I saw an advertisement in the VA USA jobs for a yoga therapist, I think in Maryland or somewhere in that area. So it's coming. Okay, now we're going to talk about yoga philosophy. And I'm juxtaposing these two images to help us understand the difference between the model of self that we are accustomed to working with in Western medicine and the model of self in yoga philosophy, particularly the relationship between mind and body. So Descartes' famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," introduces a separation between what he regarded to be the soul, the human soul, and the body, which he regarded as sort of inert mass that could be manipulated without consequence. By contrast, in yoga, the body is considered to be a vehicle for self-realization, a vehicle for increasing understanding of oneself, rather than a thing that's separate from the I that lives up here in the head. We'll talk more, I'm just going to repeat that point over and over, basically. So in the Vedantic model of self, as you recall, the point of yoga is to return us to our true nature, which is unlimited, unchanging spiritual union with everything. But the body and the layers of human experience get in the way of that. In Vedic philosophy, they're called koshas or sheaths. And maya means a veil. And so these obscure the truth, they obscure the reality, and we get caught up in them, and it's very hard to get back to that reality. That's why we have to practice. Okay, so the Annamaya kosha is also known as the food body. You can think of this as instinctual drives. The drives for food, sex, self-preservation. It's sort of like almost like the limbic system, if you can think of it that way. I'm not saying that there are absolute correlates in the nervous system, but these are metaphors we can use to think about this. The Pranamaya kosha is the body of breath, the sheath of vital energy. In traditional Chinese medicine, it would be regarded as qi, the level of the body that's affected by acupuncture. So this is the interface between the physical body and the mind, and so it's regarded as a very crucial intersection, and this is treated mainly with pranayama. But the Manomaya kosha is the sort of the chattering mind. It's the part of the mind that doesn't have a lot of self-awareness. It could be memories, thoughts, plans, fantasies, ruminations, chatter. It can be things that you memorize for work or for school. But it doesn't have an inherent sense of value, okay? It doesn't really relate to the true sense of self. It's mind stuff, and it can get in our way. You can think about the default mode network, which generates ruminative thought as maybe, an analog. The Vijnanamaya kosha is more the sense of the body, the mind is an instrument. it's calm, collected discernment rather than a sense of intellectual excitement that can carry us away. And the Anandamaya Kosha is the body of bliss, which is contacted through meditation. So it's a little bit different, right, from the model of self we may be walking around with in Western medicine, where there's the mind and then there's the body that we do stuff to. Okay, so the 8 limbs of yoga, this is the core philosophy of yoga, the things that we do, the practices, and these are just gross summaries. But the limbs of yoga provide some guidance and vision necessary for understanding what we're doing when we practice yoga. So the yamas and niyamas are restraints and observances that allow us to make good decisions about what to eat or not to eat, what to say or not to say, behaviors to engage in or not to engage in an intelligent way so that we don't create more suffering for ourselves. Asana, that's what we know yoga as for the most part in the United States, the physical postures. Pranayama is control of the breath. And then the remaining limbs of yoga have more to do with meditation. So you can think of these as self-regulation strategies. An analogous concept might be skills training in dialectical behavioral therapy. Okay, so if everyone practiced the yamas and niyamas, probably a lot of us would be out of work. And again, these are crude definitions. For example, asteya, non-stealing. Okay, some people compare these to the 10 commandments of yoga, which I don't really like because these are more tools for self-exploration, self-understanding, and so non-stealing, okay, you don't take a candy bar at the 7-Eleven or you go to jail, but you can also think of non-stealing on other levels. For example, academic honesty, not taking credit for what someone else has said or published. Not stealing from yourself, so getting enough sleep at night. Okay, so some people would regard shortchanging your sleep as stealing from yourself, stealing from your overall health. So these philosophical concepts can be applied to multiple levels of the mind and the body. And when observed, they help us regulate ourselves, reduce suffering. As we practice these, we begin to see the excessive attractions and aversions that drive a large part of our behavior and bring them into awareness, so then we can make a conscious decision. So if you don't go by the yamas and niyamas, kleshas will result, stress. So we forget the true nature of the self. We get caught up in strong desires and aversions. We get caught up in fear of being outperformed, outcompeted, fear of death, and of being a separate self. And these are the, according to yoga philosophy, the mistakes that get us into trouble. The vishkepa are physical manifestations of a distracted state. I like to think of this as a mental status exam plus. So if you were doing an initial assessment on somebody who's going to begin yoga therapy, you might pay attention to their facial expression, their psychomotor agitation or slowing, but also their breathing. Okay, so you want to see, is it a shallow pattern of breathing that suggests sympathetic overload? Is it lethargic posture? So these physical indications help determine what the therapy will be. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about some of the current thought about why yoga works. And there are 4 different categories of practice that this is not exhaustive, but these are the 4 I'm going to talk about because these are the ones that are most available to people and the practices that most people engage in. So asana, everybody knows what the asana is, downward facing dog. the breathing meditation, and yoga nidra, which really I could really do an entire lecture on yoga nidra, which is the practice of yogic sleep or deep relaxation. Okay, so now we're returning back to that early 20th century gap. The initial research done in India was mainly on meditators and on breathing practices and inversions. And so they were interested in whether those practices could alter gas exchange, could alter oxygen, carbon dioxide levels, and change autonomic function. And so they found that these advanced practitioners who had practiced daily for years were able to some extent to regulate their heart rate, respiratory rate, and some elements of their metabolism and autonomic function. Jumping ahead, I really recommend this article if you're interested in the biological mechanisms of yoga. So this is more inclusive, it includes other mind-body therapies, but the concepts apply. There's what's called a top-down effect and a bottom-up effect. So the bottom-up effect refers to the kind of cumulative effects, downstream effects of the physical practices and the breathing practices and the meditation. Okay, so those are initiated with conscious exertion of muscles or the muscles associated with respiration, and they end up altering immune response, altering catecholamine production, altering production of other neurotransmitters. So those effects are generated from the bottom up. That's the work, that's the sweat, that's the digging with the shovel, okay? The other set of effects is top down. So when we engage in, let's say, an asana, we're doing tree pose, and we're consciously moving the inner thigh toward the foot, consciously moving the weight backward, checking in with the breathing. That creates a feedback loop, okay, between some of the cortical areas and the proprioceptive centers in the body. And so that exerts a top-down effect that we're controlling with our will and our consciousness, our breathing, and our response to these kind of challenging physical postures we're in. Okay, so bottom-up effects. We're activating muscle groups that we usually don't contact, like a lot of psoas and sort of intercostal muscles that we might not otherwise be ever experiencing. Regulating the breath and maintaining balanced muscle tone, so balance between exertion and repose. Okay, so it's like a gradation or a measured use of effort. Okay, and the aim is to obtain a state of euphony or well-balanced tension. There's some work going on, but you're not operating at your maximum, or there's a mindful awareness of how much effort you're using, which areas of the body are appropriate to be working and which ones should be passive. In Western medicine, we don't talk very much about the role of fascia. It's considered like the stuff that's in the way that you cut away in an anatomy lab, but a fascia is extremely important in yoga in terms of fluid dynamics, and it has some immune function as well. The biotensegrity model, let me show you a picture. Okay, so we start out with bone, like dead bones, the original, and then we have biomechanics, like the pulleys and levers, and the muscles are doing things, and with feedback loops. And then the biotensegrity model is a little bit different. It conceptualizes structures, and in particular the human body, as a balance between compression and expansion forces. So in order to expand the physical body, there is a role of consciousness, a role of awareness and intention in moving from a slumped posture to an expanded posture. So this is very important for understanding how people can get into positions that require opposite actions that seem impossible on the basis of our old biomechanical models. Okay. Another important part of the bottom-up effects is the activation of vagal afferent activity. There's a lot of really good information on the polyvagal theory. The majority of vagal nerve fibers are afferent and communicate peripheral information up to the brain. Vagal tone is important for strengthening the parasympathetic nervous system, which allows us to relax and recover from sympathetic overload. It's impacted by slow rhythmic breathing and movements that involve the diaphragm. So that's why things like twists and inversions are so important in yoga. If you think about going upside down, the diaphragm is taking place in a very different activity than it normally does when the body's upright. And the compressive movements in some of the postures, like Sarvangasana or shoulder stand, enhance baroreceptor sensitivity and chemoreceptor sensitivity in the neck and the aorta. Okay, so this is the top-down effects. The basal ganglia circuits are semi-independent loops that originate from cortical regions, and they pass through the basal ganglia and then come back through the thalamus to the cortex. These have to do with body awareness, coordination, and procedural learning. They're also involved in complex higher order functions and social behavior. And these circuits promote, as we strengthen them, in increased connectivity and dynamic shifting between different circuits, motor circuits, cognitive circuits, emotional circuits. So here's an illustration of some of those loops. These are important in developing mind-body integration and self-regulation, impulse control. I think probably a lot of you have seen the TED Talk on power positions. Is it Amy Cuddy, I believe is her name? So there's some research showing that expansive, open postures have physiological effects on us. Adopting an expansive posture in a social setting is associated with decreased cortisol, increased testosterone, lower perceived pain levels, and an increased ability to take risk. Slumped postures increase levels of perceived helplessness. Back bends can help with depression, increase positive mood, and forward bends tend to be quieting and calming. So these are positive feedback loops. These postures have effects not only on physical function but psychological states as well. So there's a slide from Amy Cuddy's presentation. I felt somehow compelled to give an image of man spreading. And it's kind of interesting if you look at that top photo on the right, how the female on the end has constricted her body in order to adapt to her surroundings. And I don't know if you guys remember this little conversation down in the lower right, but if you notice, everybody, all the men are in an expanded position, but because of her restrictive clothing, Nancy Pelosi has to keep her knees together. And so she's limited as to how she can express herself. Does that have consequences? I don't know. You can think about it. Okay, effects of breathing techniques. So there's a set of breathing techniques they're slow, rhythmic, and they're intended to calm down the nervous system and promote parasympathetic tone. And then there's a set of breathing practices that are fast, forceful, and they tend to stimulate the body. So those are good for working with dementia, depression, like sort of torpid states where people need more stimulation. Not so great for anxiety or working with trauma. So it was thought for a long time that pranayama will change oxygen levels, but that's not really the case. Breath regulation can decrease oxidative stress, increase cardiovagal baroreflex sensitivity, and can promote the release of prolactin and oxytocin. So there's a pro-social response associated there. Okay, so this is talking about the more stimulating breathing practices. I'm just going to move on through here. Meditation is a way to train the mind to rein it in from the sort of what's called the monkey mind in Buddhist tradition, swinging from one thought to another, and getting control of this thought process, bringing consciousness back to the original focus, allows us to modulate our behavior. So we think less about ourselves as the center of the universe and more about the broader context of how our behavior affects other people. Okay, so this is called metacognitive awareness, awareness of our awareness, conscious monitoring of our own mental processes. So we notice when we drift from what we thought we were talking about to something else. There are different kinds of meditation. There's focused attention where you're maintaining focus on the breath or a candle or some other object or image. And so the idea there is when the mind drifts away, to consciously bring it back. There's another form of open focus, open monitoring attention, which is just sort of letting the mind do what it's going to do, much more challenging. So most of the research I've got here is on focused attention. During this process, you can observe the physical signals of emotional responses like frustration, boredom, and just notice them without judgment, without allowing those physical responses to take over your behavior, take over all of your attention. So this decreases rumination and mind wandering. Okay, this one is important. So there are 4 phases in the focused attention meditation, and this helps with all of life, okay? So the mind wanders. This is the default mode network just going bananas and taking us from our shopping list to what kind of shoes are those she's wearing over there to, this, that, and the other thought. This is where the painful rumination of depression and anxiety take place. Okay, this circuit. It doesn't mean that this circuit is all bad, but if you're primarily operating in this network, there will be a lot of repetitive, useless, painful information that you're replaying to yourself. Okay, and then you say, I've done it again. I'm thinking about what I'm going to plant in my garden this spring instead of thinking about my breath. So that's the awareness of the mind wandering, and that engages the salience network. What's important right here? What am I supposed to be paying attention to? And then you redirect the attention, okay, coming back to the breath, which involves the executive network, and sustaining that attention, even though your feet are tingling and numb and you're really hungry and you're wondering what time it is, but sustaining the attention on the breath engages the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved with assessments of value. What's important right now? What's my priority? So it allows you to align your priority with your purpose. It's also important to note that area of the executive network is involved with addiction, overvaluing certain behaviors or substances, and retraining that area to value something different. And this just shows how the brain is moving back and forth between those networks. Okay, effects on physical health. Exercise, all exercise is good. Yoga tends to reduce cortisol levels because of its effect on the HPA axis. It's associated with greater levels of GABA. And after just 6 weeks of yoga, you can produce measurable changes in total peripheral resistance, arterial compliance, stroke volume, cardiac output. I don't believe I put heart rate variability on here, but that's also true. I did. That's the next one down. So heart rate variability is important because it's one of the key indicators of a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. These are all effects on subjective sense of well-being. We talked about this. And I'm going to return to that in a minute. Yoga Nidra, yogic sleep. So this is a practice. It's a very particular kind of guided meditation. It's got different parts to it that have different purposes, body sensing, and then progressive relaxation, a breathing exercise, and then there's other stuff. The effect of this practice is to extend the hypnagogic phase of sleep, where we have a lot of alpha activity and just maybe a little bit of theta. That phase of sleep or phase of consciousness usually only lasts about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we're asleep. So this allows us to extend and train that response so that we remain in that hypnagogic state for 30 minutes, an hour. Okay? Increases alpha wave activity. People who are expert at practicing Yoga Nidra maintain awareness while they are physically sleeping. They're aware of sleeping. It's associated with reduced negative emotions and increased positive feelings, even though problems are still going on. This is Richard Miller. He teaches a form of Yoga Nidra called iRest. I had the pleasure and privilege of doing a 3-day meditation retreat with him, and he's a PhD psychologist as well, and has there's a lot of research specifically on iRest for self-regulation, reducing the default mode network activity associated with rumination. So back to my original point, this network is also involved in the construction of an autobiographical self, I, me. So if you sort of suppress that sense of self, the opportunity arises to feel a sense of connection, interconnectedness, as well as an awareness of interoceptive sensory stimuli. Okay. Default mode network again. Some of these studies have to do with research on dementia. There's some changes in visual acuity, working memory, fluid intelligence. And this is sort of a summary slide that all these practices work in a global holistic manner to improve human functioning on multiple levels and in multiple domains at the same time. So the overall effect is to decrease allostatic load so that the autonomic nervous system does not have to respond with high levels of stress hormones and inflammatory cytokines. We talked about the vagus nerve. We talked about this some. There is a wealth of information out there if you want to read some of the research on different topics. So this slide. Okay, so the good news is yoga helps just about with everything that ails you at different ways at the same time. The bad news is this makes it hard to do research on yoga because we, in Western medicine, we're usually looking for a specific endpoint. What is the effect on interleukin-6 production? What is the effect on triglycerides? Okay, so we're looking at a specific endpoint, but yoga doesn't necessarily, it works in a more integrated way. And so if we were doing research from the perspective of yoga therapy, we would be measuring something like a comprehensive healing outcome, which is sort of an alien concept in Western medicine. So that poses a challenge. So we have the Oxford criteria for evidence-based medicine. Timothy McCall has suggested that when we look at and assess the effectiveness of yoga therapy, we apply this, the basically level of effectiveness or level of evidence. So the best evidence would come from yoga therapy that is individualized by a very experienced therapist, and then the worst evidence would be, somebody watches a video and then you measure their heart rate variability. Okay, so these are challenges to doing research on yoga therapy. These are some of the factors that sort of repeats that slide before, factors of success. This I'm not going to read all these. I'm going to flip through them quickly so that you can see some of the conditions and problems that respond positively to yoga therapy. So there's a lot of research on musculoskeletal issues, arthritis, chronic pain, helping with acceptance and transition of life with cancer and other terminal illnesses. We talked about Dean Ornish. Yoga and some meditation practices can slow the shortening of telomeres and slow the aging process. Glycemic control. Like I said, a decreased production of downstream inflammatory cytokines. There's a lot of good information on that. I really like that article, Solon, if you want to read these things. That's a really good one. Okay, palliative care. I just want to back up and say that in a lot of ways, the practice of yoga is designed to help us prepare for the moment of death. Okay, or separation from this physical food body. Okay, so again, that the primary purpose is to remind us of our true nature, which is essential, unchanging. Just happen to be parked in this body at the moment. I think the research in pediatrics is important in terms of what we know about epigenetic changes and the intergenerational effects of trauma. And I just like some pictures. These are some good books if you want to educate yourself more on yoga therapy. And this is one of the main sources that I use. It's kind of a comprehensive handbook for using yoga therapy in different arenas of healthcare. I know that I sped through some of that. I wanted to see if anybody has questions. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned a couple of the hormones. I think that you mentioned that testosterone was one, and then prolactin and oxytocin. So you showed some pictures about the male thing, whatever. So are we looking at testosterone as what gives you, are you looking at that as maybe giving you more energy, or making you more assertive, or what are we?
Okay, that's a good question, and I'm actually some conflicting research came out after that initial study of levels of cortisol and testosterone. Basically, there are variable effects of postures depending upon the intention. And so the expansive postures tend to be more stimulating. They tend to activate the sympathetic nervous system in people who might be depressed, might have ambivalence about expressing themselves or asserting themselves. And so what they found when they did those open postures is that people had higher levels of testosterone, but then they went back and measured women, and they did not have quite the same response. So those initial studies were done on men. Okay, so that's being challenged, but I think that the association between occupying space and sense of self, ability to assert oneself definitely has downstream effects in terms of neurotransmitters and hormones. The bit about oxytocin and prolactin, where those are postures or practices that tend to be more calming. So for example, a forward bend or a compression that sort of reduces the physical space of the body and has a different effect. So that this is why a yoga therapist would look at a person's difficulties and physical frame and decide, this person needs a lot of stimulating practices, a lot of back bends, a lot of fast breathing, a lot of retention with breathing. That might not be appropriate for somebody with severe PTSD. So the effects differ depending upon the specificity of the practice. Does that help?
Yeah, and then you also said something about yoga intake.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say what that would be?
So There is a, I thought about putting in an example of a yoga intake form. It's like an assessment, an initial assessment that would take into account the person's, it's like an H&P. Okay, so the person's, what their complaint is, what their diet, sleep patterns, lifestyle is like, the quality of their relationships, their beliefs about themselves, their level of physical activity. So all different, and from an Ayurvedic perspective, is this somebody who's really Pitta dosha, or somebody who's got like chronically Vata deranged, so there's an element of Western medicine, psychological evaluation, and Ayurveda, as well as analysis of musculoskeletal imbalances. So I had to limit myself somewhere. Yes?
I was wondering if you could say something about the effects of different types of yoga on different health outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
As an example, I had the pleasure of learning Sudarshan Kriya Yoga under Susi Ravi Shankar. It's a breathing-based yoga you're probably familiar with, but it mixes both rapid and slow breathing, and I thought it was very good in terms of self-exploration, stress reduction, keeping you relaxed, but also keeping you motivated to go and repeating cycles.
Breathing practices are by far the most they have the most potential for adverse effects. They're very powerful, and in the tradition I study, they are to be treated with utmost respect and not even introduced until a student is secure in physical practice for a couple of years. They can be very transformative. They can be energizing. I have also seen them initiate a psychotic episode. Yeah. So, and the oral tradition, like I said, is full of cautionary tales of people who practice too much pranayama, or they practiced pranayama right after they did asana practice and basically got overstimulated. So for a person who has a tendency towards psychotic episodes, it is to be approached with caution and under the guidance of a very experienced teacher. Having said that, there's also some interesting research, some preliminary evidence that some of those practices can help with the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So, like I said, it's a very delicate balance, and it needs to be approached on an individualized basis. Is that answer or?
Well, I guess in part, yeah.
How?
I don't know if there's more standardized studies that have been done comparing different types of yoga for different health outcomes.
Oh, okay. The types of yoga that I've run across more often than not have been just hatha yoga, sort of like a gentle restorative yoga, Iyengar yoga. So the kinds of like hot yoga that you would go experience in a mall kind of environment that's going to be really inappropriate for somebody with congestive heart failure or kidney disease. So this is part of the problem that Timothy McCall is talking about in that hierarchy of effectiveness, that until we define some of those criteria, it's going to be hard to get a good study of cause and effect of different types of yoga. Yes, sir?
When you were doing your research in India about yoga, did you come across the National Yoga Initiative that was recently started, how they were trying to integrate the Surya Namaskaram asana for children growing up?
I'm not aware of that. Would you like to say more about that? I'm curious.
Oh, so about 3 years ago, the Prime Minister wanted to get like a national yoga initiative for all school children up till high school,
Mm-hmm.
so that they start in the morning. It's called Surya Namaskaram, which basically means like give rise to the sun or say hi to the sun,
Mhm.
and they do different positions. The asanas, it's about 8 positions where it's supposed to improve, daily function, and, have more energy throughout the day. And I was just wondering if you had any exposure with that.
No, I'm glad to hear about that. I think that's brilliant, and those, like I said, the kind of the intergenerational transmission of, trauma, suffering, maladaptive patterns could really be interrupted with the institution of those kinds of practices in elementary education. So thank you.
I just wanted to add, some of those, the Surya Namaskara actually involves certain opening up
Mhm.
and some postural changes, which I think connect very well with what you're saying. And it's not very long
Right.
to do. And I think to some degree, you could think about, and now almost as what we talk about is the expectation of, say, what used to be prayer
Mhm.
at the beginning of school. So I think there's, but obviously,
Mm.
to the state, but something more physiological plus psychological like this.
Right, that's multivalent in its effects. Yeah, I think you're preaching to the choir here. Yeah. Anybody else? Thank you. I appreciate your attention.